Meraki is a small independent music venue located around a mile just north of Liverpool city centre. It's not a huge space. The inside space holds around 300 people and the outside space can have up to around 500 people. The music generally focuses on underground dance music. The venue's been open since 2016 and kind of found its feet in the latter half of that time period. It was very much so on its feet from around January to March 2020, and we all know what happened then.
We all know the devastating effects the pandemic had on our social lives, and for nightclub owners like George Griffin, the restrictions were particularly harmful. When your business model relies on a mass of people in close proximity, dancing, singing and the rest of it, social distancing is of course near impossible, so these businesses just couldn't carry on as usual. But COVID was in fact just the tip of the iceberg for an industry already facing serious threats in the form of rising rents and rapid development. And even in 2022, after restrictions had been lifted, the UK lost an average of 14 nightclubs a month. In that same year, plans to build homes across the road from Meraki put the music venue in danger.
To explain what the development was, the building itself is like a bonded tea warehouse, and that's what it was built for about 110 years ago. It's a huge, massive building, and it's 10 metres across the road from us. So it's really, really close, and they wanted to put 206 apartments in it, I think. So one of the windows from the flats would literally have been 10 or 11 metres from our front door, right next to the venue. So as I'm sure you can imagine, the amount of noise that a nightclub makes is not necessarily conducive to someone living 11 metres away from that.
Realising that this new development would make Meraki a prime target for noise complaints, owner George rallied his regulars and the support of the community to write to the developer directly and then to Liverpool City Council. It was a bureaucratic and frustrating petition process, but in the end, over 730 responses were sent, and it paid off.
The application was refused by Liverpool Council for, I think they listed around 10 reasons why they've refused planning permission. So they weren't taking into account that development would have an impact on pre-existing businesses already within the area, i.e. us. And the other one was that the area that we're in, which is a small area called 10 Streets, and it zones this area as predominantly for industrial and employment uses, so specifically not residential.
For now, Meraki lives to survive another day and night. It's a success story in a sea of closures, and one that still doesn't guarantee survival. In cities around the world, there's a tug-of-war happening between residents and revelers, councils and culture makers. On the one hand, there's the desire for vibrant downtowns and neighbourhoods. On the other, there's the friction that comes from actually living in them. On this episode of Common Ground, we're in the UK and the Netherlands, talking to the people pushing the agenda for the nighttime economy and finding out how cities and towns can embrace their nightlife for the benefit of residents, visitors and business owners. Stay with us. This is a podcast by TOPOSOPHY. For more than a decade, TOPOSOPHY has been inspiring and informing its clients on how to transform places, whether they're neighbourhoods, cities, regions, or whole countries. The TOPOSOPHY team works with international organisations, multinational brands, and government agencies around the world, leading them every step of the way to find placemaking and marketing solutions that are built to last. As constantly curious people, the team loves to collect game-changing ideas that are transforming other sectors and draw valuable lessons for the future of places. This podcast series, curated by the TOPOSOPHY team, is just one example of how these valuable ideas are brought to life.
The really interesting thing is, once we started this work, I think we were one of the first agencies in the world, actually, but certainly the first in the UK, to really take a magnifying glass and put it over these venues because they were all independent.
That's Mark Davyd, venue owner, music lover, and founder of the charity championing British nightlife, the Music Venue Trust. The charity's team act as mediators, researchers, spokespeople and campaigners for independent music venues across the UK. It was formed in 2014 to support and protect an important part of British culture, a live music scene that's given birth to the world's best-loved musicians.
What you see is in our sector, in our 2022 survey, there are 30,000 full-time equivalent jobs. Those are jobs just at the venue. There were 177,000 performances, different concerts, taking place across the UK. They were performed by nearly 500,000 individual musicians. I mean, that's an astonishing number of people that can find a space to work. And then you look at the structure of what a band is. A band is the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people on stage, plus the person who does the guitars, the person who does the drums, the person who looks after the sound, the person who looks after the lights, the merch manager, the tour manager, the manager of the band, the agent, the agent's assistant, the promoter, the promoter's assistant. There are hundreds of thousands of people that rely on these venues to be able to make a living.
The nighttime economy offers opportunity, but in the UK, the number of those working in these industries dropped by over 500,000 between 2019 and 2022, with the pandemic playing a major role. And it's not just about music, it's the whole ecosystem of what a sold-out gig brings to an area.
For every £10 spent just on a ticket, £17 was being spent elsewhere in the nighttime economy. And that's being spent on bars, restaurants, taxis, public transport. I always call this the kebab question. I've eaten a lot of kebabs in my life, but I've never left my house at 11 o'clock to go and buy a kebab. That's never happened, you know. But I leave the music venue and I'm hungry and maybe I've had a few drinks and I'll go to the kebab house. How do you make sure that we've got jobs for people who work in kebab restaurants or takeaway restaurants late into the night?
But beyond the money and the jobs is the fact that a buzzing nightlife is also a key part of a place's culture and identity.
It's a place where you can form your own identity, meet people from outside your bubble. I think it also makes you a more open person.
That's Ramon De Lima, music journalist, part-time raver, and the former Night Mayor of Amsterdam.
And it's also a place, when we look at the cultural value, where a lot of experiment is happening. We also see that different art forms are coming together inside the club.
The Night Mayor is head of the independent Night Mayor Foundation, a role that's been advising the city on its nighttime economy for the past 20 years. Since it was established in 2003, more than 40 cities across the globe have followed suit, from Berlin in Germany to Cali in Colombia.
You don't need a lot of education or experience to just get started in nightlife. Not only musicians and DJs, but also people who are working in graphic design, for example, designing flyers or posters for a club night. People working in production. I actually also learned to be an entrepreneur in nightlife. Yeah, if you look at the value of nightlife, it isn't just value in money, but of course also value socially and culturally.
So given that the nightlife is such an important part of our cities, why is it under threat? Let's take a closer look. Here's Mark from the Music Venue Trust again.
When we did a report in 2015, we found 22 different reasons why a music venue would close. But we didn't find one single music venue that closed for only one of those reasons. They closed for a combination of normally 5, 6, even 10 different reasons. So the ones that people hear about the most is noise complaints. Within the British planning framework and within the environmental health framework, the overriding primary right belongs to the resident, and it's the right to the peaceful enjoyment of your own home. That seems quite logical and sensible and fair, except what happens when somebody decides to move next to the venue? Should they be able to say, by the way, I want you to turn the music off? When a developer wants to build brand new flats next to a venue in the planning regulations, should they be able to build flats that aren't actually soundproofed to prevent the venue from getting complaints?
Mark and his team from the Music Venue Trust have worked with local governments around the UK to research, report and advise them on better planning policies when it comes to the nighttime economy. The goal is to shift the balance between developers and culture and deal with the challenges of noise. These set of policies are what helped George, the owner of Meraki at the beginning of the show. Collectively, they're known as the agent of change.
The broad principles are that if you want to make a change to a neighbourhood or an area, you are responsible for the change that you want to make. We've been very successful agents of change. I have to give credit to a chap called John Wardle, who is the live music officer in Australia. Australia was the first place we heard about. John was the first person who ever said the words agent of change to me.
The agent of change refers to a set of policies that state that whoever makes a change to an area should be the one who's responsible for mitigating the potential negative impacts. So if a developer wants to build a set of flats opposite a noisy music venue, it's on them to properly soundproof the buildings. At the moment, the policies only apply to new developments, but there are plans for putting the onus on residents moving into an existing property too. This would mean new neighbours would acknowledge, on paper, that a good night's sleep isn't always going to be guaranteed in their new home. It's one of many ways that a city council can be more proactive when it comes to easing this friction between residents and business owners.
The main thing to understand is that frequently the reason that developers want to build in an area is because cultural regeneration has taken place. If we look at an area like the Northern Quarter in Manchester, nobody went to the Northern Quarter in the 80s. It was a known wasteland, frankly. It was a terrible place to be. It was full of crime, full of drugs. It really was a very, very difficult part of Manchester. A maverick guy came along called Jan Oldenburg and opened a place called the Night and Day. The Night and Day was out on a limb. It was amongst all that kind of negativity about that area. But over a period of 30 years, Night and Day has revolutionised the Northern Quarter. It's full of bars, it's full of clubs and restaurants and music venues and activity and takeaways and everything. It's the place you go in Manchester now. It just revolutionised the whole of that area. In the process of doing so, everybody wanted to live there. Everybody wanted to be around the thriving culture. And because we didn't have agent of change and didn't really come into the planning framework in the UK until 2017, what happens is that you end up with the ridiculous situation where flats were built right next door to the Night and Day, and it's still problematic. They're still in court arguing about a noise complaint, when obviously if you move next door to the Night and Day, because you want to be in a thriving area, it's going to be difficult to sleep. Because everybody knows that's where you go until 3 or 4 a.m.
So the agent of change policies aim to protect venues like Night and Day in Manchester and Meraki in Liverpool against new developments. But what about the people who already live in an area where nightlife is flourishing? A night out often brings with it magic, mischief, or nuisance, depending on your stance. Safety and security are big concerns, with evidence that more violent crimes happen at night and studies showing that alcohol is a major factor. It's something that Ramon and the Night Mayor Foundation in Amsterdam have been trying to manage.
We always pushed for a platform for discussion where we can discuss problems we have in the city and also how we can manage to have a club within a residential area. And I think there are a few successful examples. To name one, we have the entertainment area, Rembrandtplein, which is one of the most busiest entertainment areas in the city with a lot of clubs, bars and restaurants. And they really had a problem with creating a lot of nuisance for the people who live there. There were also a lot of incidents with violence and people who were making a lot of noise. So the city reacted in the first place on these problems with just placing more police officers around the square, also putting a temporary police station in the center of the square.
Amsterdam's restrictive measures of increased police presence only made matters worse. The atmosphere darkened, the number of incidents increased, and in 2016, they turned to the Night Mayor for help. The foundation acted as a bridge between the policymakers and the cultural creatives. offering an innovative solution to the problem at hand.
Together with the University in Amsterdam, they did a research how we can approach the Ramon Square more like a festival area. So what I saw is that the festival has a few interesting things that can also be implemented on the Ramon Square, for example. So there's a lot of green, there is not litter everywhere, there are not bikes parked everywhere, it's clear where you can go. And they used that case to also make the Ramon Square a more pleasant place to visit. So they changed the lighting, there was more green, you couldn't park your bike anymore. They removed all the police officers from the square and replaced them with square hosts. And those are young people who are still in contact with the police officers, but are more easy to approach. And they are there to de-escalate situations. And what we see now in the results is that there's a drop of 25% in violent incidents, but also a 24% drop of noise nuisance.
This is one of many examples where the Night Mayor's advice has been taken on board by the city of Amsterdam and has already been rewarded by positive impacts.
And also when we look into the history of the nightlife in Amsterdam, the 24-hour policies is a good example that is proposed by the Night Mayor, is created in collaboration with the Night Mayor and is now part of our permit policy.
Amsterdam now has 17 clubs operating with 24-hour permits. This is a good thing for both partygoers and residents. Think about it. If everyone is being pushed out of a club at the same time, there's bound to be more people chatting in the streets, more people drinking, and inevitably more noise. Change that to 24 hours, and instead you'll have people leaving at different times throughout the night. So something that at first seems counterintuitive becomes a solution. But the Night Mayor Foundation doesn't only work with governments to promote safety, it also works directly with businesses. One of the ways they've been doing this is through initiatives like Club Ethics.
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting story because this already started in 2017 when we organized an event called Chicks on a Mission, which was organized because there was a great gap between female artists and male artists in the industry. There was a lack of role models. They were facing harassment on the dance floor. So we organized this conference where we talked about these subjects. So how can we make the scene and the industry more accessible for females? And how can we also fight the harassment visitors are experiencing on the dance floor? And we did some roundtables with artists, with visitors, with people working in nightlife. And that got us thinking, like, yeah, it's very normal that clubs has a policy when it comes to fire safety, that they have policy that nobody brings their weapons inside. But when it comes to social safety, there is no really a protocol or a policy. So that's quite interesting because it's also a big part of the safety of your club that you also have a policy on how you manage incidents that happens on the dance floor that involves sexual harassment or when people feel unsafe. So with this information, we started to work together with organizations like Sex Matters, gathering experiences from visitors and gathering experience from staff working in nightlife venues, and also club owners. We guide the clubs in writing policy on how to make their club more social safe and inclusive.
So far, we've talked of dialogue, communication, policies and planning. But the elephant in the club is funds. Essentially, money matters. And just like other cultural centres, the business models of theatres, art galleries and museums aren't primarily about generating sizable revenue and often don't. Paying artists, high energy costs and general maintenance leave little room for error. So when crises hit, these places are at an even higher risk. Here's Mark again.
Then the cost of living crisis hits, the amount of money being spent changed. Certainly people started buying tickets much later because they were waiting to see whether they could afford it. How much they were spending in the venues went down. And unfortunately, that altogether has resulted in where we are now in 2023. We are seeing one grassroots music venue close every week in the UK. One of the biggest challenges is, given the economic model that they're putting on something nobody wants to see yet, that's already a difficult product to sell. They're operating on a 0.2% average profit margin. When the energy bill goes up by 300%, that immediately throws them into the red.
If city councils want to be serious about fostering culture, this needs to be reflected in how they choose to invest. As it stands, in the UK, venues sit in the grey space between hospitality and cultural assets, meaning they often get overlooked when it comes to the funding they're entitled to. Recognising nighttime venues as cultural assets is something Germany is pioneering. In 2021, music venues and clubs were given the same legal status as opera houses and theatres. This grants them rights to operate in more parts of the city, gives them more tax breaks, and protects them against new development. A rethinking of what we class as a cultural asset is something Ramon wants to see in Amsterdam too.
The status as a cultural institute can help getting funding for the club itself. It can also help to protect the club from a changing environment. For example, if your new residential areas are rising in Amsterdam, clubs are mostly threatened by the rise of new resident areas because they need to move. And if you have the status of a cultural institute, you can be protected from these changes.
Okay, there's plenty the public sector can do to protect nightlife. But should it just be up to city councils? Bigger businesses within the music industry also have a vested interest in keeping the grassroots culture alive. Think about it. Ed Sheeran played over 360 shows at a grassroots level. Without smaller venues giving artists the platform to develop and gain a following, the money-making festivals and stadiums wouldn't have such an array of talent to grace their stages. Here's Mark again.
We're looking at an absolute bumper year in 2023 for live music and for streaming and for recorded and for publishing. We're looking at probably the worst year in 20 years for music venues, small music venues in towns and cities. Those two things are part of the same ecosystem, and we have to be more honest and say, this is totally unacceptable. It's unacceptable that the Manchester Co-op Live is announcing 11 nights of Harry Styles at £100 a ticket, while down the road, 17 miles away, the local music venue is closing because it doesn't have £10,000 to pay its bills. We have to bring those two things together, and we have to ask the music industry to really pay attention to the research and development that's being done in these venues and get involved.
I think the music industry itself now has a responsibility to not just be continually saying to government, well, can you do us a tax break? Can you do us this? Can you do us that? But to build something within the ecosystem that genuinely responds to the responsibility they have towards the artists of tomorrow, towards the spaces that enable those artists to come through this system. And I think it's not just an ethical and moral thing, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the sensible thing to do. And that's the message we're really putting out to the music industry now.
One company that stepped up to the challenge is Ticketmaster. In 2021, in partnership with the Music Venue Trust, they announced a 50% rebate on all tickets sold for grassroots venues across the UK. That means more money from sales going straight into the pocket of these spaces. Something that isn't going to get the average person dancing and has probably never inspired a hit punk track is data analytics. But both Ramon and Mark agree that quantifiable research plays a crucial role in policymaking, justifying the needs for strategic investment and policies for growth. In fact, one of Ramon's key milestones in his time as Night Mayor was the completion of the Night Vision research paper.
I think data is always good to have to quantize the value of nightlife, because when I'm talking about the value of night culture, I'm mostly talking about the cultural and social value of nightlife. Numbers work really well if you want to make your point. We never had really hard data when it comes to what the values of nightlife. Now we can say the nightlife brings in 60 million euros from outside the city. It shows that nightlife is actually quite important for the city, so it pays out to invest and protect the nightlife.
Information is power, and it takes collaboration with organisations like the Night Mayor Foundation in Amsterdam and the Music Venue Trust in the UK to help create well-informed policy both at home and further afield. Here's Mark again.
The fact that I can quote you statistics about the number of people who work there, the number of shows, the value of this sector was £500 million, the 0.2% profit margin. These are all actual data that governments can act on. We have regular ongoing conversations with our colleagues in North America, in Canada, in Australia, right the way across Europe. There are great associations like ours. The answer is that a huge number of different approaches are being tried. And I think that actually we are now starting to really find best practice wherever it's taking place in the world. I was in Texas recently. They have a rebate system for music venues in the whole of the state of Texas where you get a tax rebate for delivering live music to your community. I mean, that's really super cutting edge. And yes, there is now a kind of global movement on this that's being more practical about exchanging information and really starting to build up some fantastic and very positive ideas of how we embed music in our communities and how we ensure that everybody has access to live music.
Real estate affordability is at the heart of a lot of cities' problems, causing a housing crisis across the EU. As almost all the venues in the UK are leasing property, a rise in rental prices puts a significant strain on these spaces. But Mark might have a solution that'll help communities take culture into their own hands.
What we've seen is when we started this work, we identified one specific problem, which was about the ownership of these buildings. And we realised that 93% of the venue operators in the UK don't own their own building. What that means is they're permanently on a tenancy, normally a short-term tenancy, in which they have probably 18 months left on their lease. That's a good amount. Some of them don't even really have ongoing leases. And what that means is it's very difficult to plan for the future. It's very difficult to invest in the infrastructure.
So the Music Venue Trust are using a model that's been tried and tested in other sectors and is particularly popular in the UK. It's what makes the charity similar to the Landmark Trust we featured last season.
The community ownership is a long-standing concept that we're starting to see increasingly used to protect community assets. So I think it really started to take off. It's been around for several decades, but it started to take off around some of the sports grounds where communities didn't want to lose their sports facility or their local football team. It spread through to post offices, some local shops, and really we became aware of it when it started to be used to stop the closure of especially rural-based pubs. So pubs and bars where a community was going to lose a pub and bar because it didn't make sense for a brewery or for a landlord. They got together, put money together into a fund and purchased that as what's called a community benefit society. So effectively, the local community was now the owners of the pub and bar. Now, in that model, what they normally did at that point was the community also ran the bar. So they found somebody and appointed them to be the bar manager, and they worked for the Community Benefit Society. So the operator and the owner are essentially aligned. They own the bricks and mortar and the ground, and they own the business. So what we thought about was, okay, is there a model where we could take away the landlords, take away the private commercial ownership of the buildings, but keep the operators in place? And so eventually we came up with this idea that what about if we separated the ownership and the maintenance of the building from the operator that's in it? In other words, what about if we took out the commercial landlord and replaced that with a benevolent landlord? And what if that landlord effectively was the community of the music community? So our model that we came up with was to create a charitable community benefit society. That's a not-for-profit registered organisation that buys the bricks and mortar, buys the land, and then creates a new type of lease, one that isn't about the amount of money that we want to make out of the building. It's about the amount of culture that happens in the building. There will still be rent to be paid, but the rents will be more reasonable and they won't keep going up. They won't reflect the market. If there's development around the building, the developer will have to negotiate with us as the owner of the building, and we will be very clear that that building will be a live music venue, and the only way that we will ever accept that a live music venue is being closed down by development is when a developer is forced to build a brand new, even better building for the community that that venue operator can move into. I want people who live in our towns and cities to feel like they own them. I want them to feel this place belongs to me, and this is what I want it to be like. I think we're really failing ourselves, to be honest. And actually, if we can just persuade people through the ownership project we've got, through other things like it, to start thinking about whose town or city is this, that would be a massive breakthrough, not just for music venues, but for the whole of nighttime culture.
Liverpool is a UNESCO city of music. It lost its World Heritage status, but it's still a UNESCO city of music, and there's not very many of them. I mean, I feel like we're constantly on an uphill battle. The onus is entirely on us to make sure that any planning applications that might affect us, that we make our own selves aware of them. I signed up to work and run a music venue because I'm interested in music, not because I want to spend 10 hours a week focusing on planning and making sure that we just survive. Not about progressing or advancing the venue or any amazing new things we could do in the area or collaborate with other businesses, artists, whatever it might be. We have to put this amount of work in just so that we can still exist here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Common Ground. But before we leave, here's what we can take forward from what we've just heard. Beyond the topics we've covered, like noise pollution and nuisance, the nighttime economy also brings with it questions of energy consumption and waste production. But, when planned right, neighbourhoods that are home to a happening nightlife help spread visitors and residents throughout the city, easing congestion and infrastructure issues. Of course, it's always important to acknowledge the limitations of each specific place. This means analysing just how much nightlife a city can realistically handle. Only then can you set reasonable goals and, by engaging with the community, achieve them. Finally, it's clear that immense support is required for independent music venues, which play a crucial role in job creation and cultural enrichment. It's vital that stakeholders in any city recognise the comprehensive benefits that the nighttime economy brings. Next time on Common Ground.
Just like you need a health department, you need police, and you need fire, you need a department that brings fun and joy into communities.
We're looking at how the creativity of children can switch up the process of urban design and discovering why playtime is essential not just for the kids, but for the rest of the community too. This podcast was developed, researched and produced by the experts at TOPOSOPHY and the Greek Podcast Project, with production assistance from Gaia Lutz. I'm Daphne Karnizis. Thanks for listening.